what I want to do today is talk a little bit about some of the early findings from our work looking at these early symptoms of infants. And even from my first days as a graduate student, I was really interested in infant development. And so when I came to North Carolina and started working with Don Bailey, he was working on a preschool study, 3 to 5-year-olds. And it was really very novel, really exciting work, as Susan mentioned, but I really secretly, I wanted to study the babies. And what we found by studying those preschoolers is they were really a handful. That's a tough age group. So when we finally did a pilot study, we really sort of braced ourselves for what we thought were going to be sort of some really difficult issues handling the infants, and we thought we were going to have trouble separating. We thought we were, going to have crying babies all the time, because we sort of thought that infancy was going to represent a downward extension of preschool, and the preschoolers were so tough, right? You can raise our hand and testify. But in fact, what we found was really, in many ways, the opposite. And it was only a small study of about 15 infants at that time. And I was just struck by the fact that, again, the patterns were not only sort of like reduced in intensity, they were actually in many ways opposite. So instead of being hyperreactive, very difficult, we saw a lot of hypoactivity, a lot of lack of responsivity as opposed to the opposite. And it just piqued my interest all the more to try and study this in greater depth and to look at these trajectories over time. How did these shifts happen? When did they happen? What predicted them? What meaning do they have? So it's really been great to sort of transition, as Susan said, into being able to focus on these things. Because again, as academics, one of the best parts about our lives is we get to focus on the areas that we find are really interesting and compelling. So I'm excited to talk with you about some of those findings that we have in those studies, and get your input too about some of that work. So again, I know this is a broad audience, so I hope I will be able to sort of meet that sort of balance between science and sort of general community well. So if people have questions, I know we have established time at the end. I'm excited to talk further about any details that I will just maybe gloss over a little bit. So as most of you probably know, Fragile X syndrome is a single gene disorder. It's the genetic syndrome that I focused on, mainly because it really offers an opportunity to look at the intersection of many of the aspects of development that are really key. It's more prevalent and more impactful in males. And what I'm really focusing on is the fact that it's really, again, a model for many other disorders, and it's often called a portal disorder, which means it's a way for us to look at these other features and impairments and syndromes through Fragile X. So no, Prince Charles does not have Fragile X syndrome. You didn't know that. Usually I do this more at the end, wake people up a little bit and go, did you know? No. I put him up here again, a little bit of humor, but also to say that the physical phenotype is really not distinct enough, sufficiently distinct for us to be able to detect Fragile X from those features, as it is in other disorders. And so while there are physical features that are known, it's really the cognitive and behavioral aspects that have gotten most of the attention. And for me in particular, I'm really most interested in autism, which is a really important and somewhat controversial area in our field, looking at the high elevation of features and the diagnostic comorbidity in many children. Also really interested in anxiety as a comorbid feature. So really focusing on Fragile X itself as a syndrome, but ways to study these other dimensions of impairment within a Fragile X model. And so, again, as most of you know, here at the Mind Institute, autism is represented by two core symptom features: social communication impairments and restricted and repetitive behaviors. It's gotten a lot of attention because of the high prevalence, but also the diverse spectrum, where some individuals are severely affected and others are more mildly affected. And so this really calls into importance the value of studying this disorder and understanding sort of the mechanisms associated. Because we do see impairments even really early in life that can extend throughout adulthood. And so understanding what predicts those and how we can treat is really key. And again, autism has increased in prevalence over time, right now affecting as many as 1 in 68 individuals. So the diagnosis of autism has really been a focus of a lot of research, primarily because what we know is if we can diagnose autism accurately and early, we can initiate treatment. that's been known to really reduce the impairment associated with autism. So there's been a lot of effort aimed at detecting these features early in life and whether these features are stable over time. And what we know is that a stable diagnosis can occur at about 3 years of age. Although if you have a specialty clinic or you have a lot of expertise, we can often see the signs and detect autism as young as 18 months to 24 months of age. But the stability increases quite a bit by the time the individuals are 3. But about the median age of diagnosis is still a little bit over 4. So even though we know there are features present and we have a good understanding of some of the emerging aspects of autism, there's still a great delay between the presence of those symptoms and the actual diagnosis. And this, again, is really impactful on the individuals, families, and sort of the communities that serve them. So a lot of the work in this field has sort of shifted down towards really early features, sort of risk markers for individuals towards the effort of detecting these individuals early. And a lot of this work has been done with high-risk individuals, specifically a baby siblings model, which is looking at babies who have older siblings diagnosed with autism, because those individuals are at elevated risk, greater risk than just the general community. About 19% of siblings, there's only one child in the family, will go on to have autism themselves. So because autism is what we call a behavioral diagnosis, you have to have the 2 core features to a certain degree, have impairment associated with them. We're relying on the emergence of these features, which can be very tricky. So looking at individuals who are at high risk is a really powerful model for us to be able to track these individuals over time and look to see what predicts these features. So what I want to do is transition into looking at asking some of these questions and looking at some of the data from a Fragile X lens. Because there's just this high association of autism with Fragile X, and not only representing features but also diagnostic impairment, it's really important to look to see whether some of the same features we see in non-syndromic or idiopathic autism that we don't know the cause of are similar or different. So this is a tape of a 9-month-old male with the full mutation. This excerpt is from the lab tab, which stands for the Laboratory-Based Temperament Assessment Battery. This task is designed, it's a toy play task. He's given a basket of toys, and we just videotape for 3 minutes. Whatever he does with the toys, we go back and look at his attention. We look at how many toys he plays with, what he does with them. And what are we seeing? He's chosen one toy, and he's very repetitively playing with this toy. He does, I won't show the entire time, he does play with it the entire time, just continuously turning it over. He's now going to sort of go over to the kitchen area where there's tile, and then there's sort of this also the sound associated with playing with the toy. So what we're seeing at this very early age is some striking features that seem very similar to autism that's not associated with Fragile X. So we'll track him. We've seen this child at 24 months of age, and we're going to keep tracking him up until he's 5. So what we've done is we've not only gathered information looking at these more observational experimental measures, but we've also conducted some actual ratings on standardized assessments as well. And what I want to do is show you some early data from the AOC. The AOC stands for the Autism Observation Scale for Infants. It's developed, in some ways, it's sort of like a baby ADOS. It's for kids 6 months to 18 years of age, and it was designed to detect these early markers at an age where, it's important to do so. So what you can see here on the y-axis is this is the proportion of individuals who display that trait, and on the X are the actual items themselves. So the red line represents the individuals with full mutation, Fragile X. The blue line are the siblings who are at risk, and then the black line are the typically developing individuals. So this is from a paper we published in 2016, and it's very preliminary. We don't have the outcome data for these individuals. So the siblings and the kids with Fragile X are considered at high risk for autism. And so what we wanted to do is see how they differed. And what we found was that really it was the motor domain, the atypical motor behaviors, motor control, were the most salient features that emerged at 12 months of age. And this differentiated them from the typicals and from the SIBs. And then secondarily, we also saw reduced social babbling, reduced eye contact, and imitation, also as potential features that emerged at this early age that discriminated the groups. We'll be following them up to see whether these features predict autism later on. But right now, it's just sort of a snapshot at 12 months of age looking at these features. So I wanted to just show you a clip of one of the items. Beautiful, right? So this individual that I'll show you first has the full mutation. Sorry, there we go.
Do it.
And these are all 12-month-olds. So not only does he not imitate, but he's also inspecting and kind of rotating it too. This individual we have followed, he's now 6 years old, and he is the most severe, has the highest severity score in our group. So he showed these signs early on, and they were predictive, at least in this one individual. Again, we don't have many that we followed up at that long of an age. This is a little girl with the premutation. So we also have a group with the premutation. It's a small group, but we're asking some of the same questions in that group. So when we look again, this is these are the males with Fragile X. I just wanted to show you a little bit of the data with the females. Again, it's a small sample. I only have 7 females with the full mutation, and I'm actually not funded to see the females, but there's just so little work done on females in general and virtually nothing done on babies. So when I found the individuals with the full mutation, I've included them. And so again, these are not statistical comparisons, but what we can see is that, you know, the dimensions seem a little bit different in some areas. We'll have to keep collecting data to see if it's a significant difference, but right now it looks like the girls are not as impaired in social referencing, perhaps. Motor control isn't quite as low, and the social interest and affect seems a little bit different across the groups. So we're seeing some potential sex effects, perhaps as early as 12 months. Again, just preliminary data about sort of the questions we're asking and kind of how we're measuring those questions. So at the heart of a lot of this is really what's causing these differences, and, you know, why do they emerge? Why are they stable in some kids? Why are they not stable in others? These are really complex questions, and the notion is that it really is related primarily to genetic factors associated with Fragile X, specifically the production of FMRP. So what we know is that FMRP is, it binds with messenger RNA and plays an important role in neural development across all individuals, and that a high proportion of the candidate genes for autism are actually being regulated by FMRP. So this provides some evidence or hypothesis that a lot of the behaviors that we're seeing in Fragile X are related to FMRP expression. And again, this is a really small sample, but we've just started really analyzing and collecting the genetic data for the work. And what you can see is right now, using the new quantitative measure, that there's actually a relationship with higher expression of FMRP and lower symptoms of autism. So that's the ADOS score on the y-axis and the FMRP measure. The blue dots are males with the full mutation. The red is the one female that we have at this point. So these are areas that we're going to continue to follow up and see if it holds. In addition to looking at genetic factors, we've also looked at autonomic factors, and this study represents an examination of looking at the relationship between heart activity and autism severity symptoms. So on the y-axis is the CARS, which is a measure of autistic severity, and on the X is the interbeat interval, which is basically the time between heartbeats. So less time means a faster heartbeat. More time means a slower heartbeat. So what we saw in this work was, and this is just cross-sectional, was that lower arousal was actually related with outcomes at 36 months of age on the cars versus we saw the shift, and it was higher arousal in infants that were older than 12 months of age. So in some ways, we were actually seeing the clinical observations that we made of these kids being sort of under-aroused and being sort of lethargic and being a little hypo-responsive. We saw that pattern replicated in the heart activity. So now what we're going to do is we're going to measure the correlation between the heart activity and the behaviors and see if the coupling perhaps is what's predictive of the later outcomes. So this first study was just looking at toy play, and then what we've done is we've continued to collect these data, and we're seeing the same patterns across different epochs. So in the first set of bars, it's looking at baseline heart activity where the kids are just watching a video, so nothing is being demanded. It's at the beginning of the day. And then the second set of graphs have to do with their heart activity during the AOC. So during all of these experimental paradigms that we have, whether it's the ADOS or the AOC, their lab tab, the experimental anxiety, we're looking at heart activity during those activities. And so what we're finding is not only are the levels seem to be different, but the regulation patterns follow what you'd expect, but also parallel those different profiles. And what I'm specifically speaking to is that when a challenge is presented or something demands our attention, physiologically, we will regulate efficiently if we sort of reduce our heart rate and sort of look at these measures, and it increases the functional activity. So what we've seen so far in these early babies is that autism features do appear to be present in the first year of life. Some of the features are the same in Fragile X as seem to be present in non-syndromic or idiopathic autism. Genetic markers may index the emergence. Again, we're sort of collecting those data. These are just sort of snapshots. And then atypical arousal also seems to be associated with these behaviors and with the risk. So I'm going to transition now to focusing a little bit on anxiety. And one of the reasons I'm interested in both is because they overlap quite a bit. So we're interested in the presentation of features of anxiety in these young kids, both to help explain maybe this relationship with autism, because sometimes it could be the case that individuals are diagnosed with autism when it could be really the presentation of anxiety that's accurate, or it could be that both occur. So what we want to do is study these and be able to detect that and track them again over time. So I guess I want to start a little bit by taking a few minutes by talking about anxiety. And I've just had such great conversations with so many of you today who have sort of echoed the exact same things that I'm about to say in terms of recognize the complexity of anxiety itself. And I think a lot of the work both in Fragile X and in autism itself to me is almost represents like a second phase or a second generation of research in a sense of we've recognized that anxiety is a common occurrence in both of these disorders, but what we've done is it's sort of been using kind of blunt measures and blunt descriptors, which have been really important to call to attention the fact that we need to look at this more closely. I think what we're doing now is entering a phase where we're looking at things with a little more refinement and a little more specificity, which to me are absolutely crucial, especially when we talk about anxiety. So a lot of people will say, oh, it's because of anxiety, or I have anxiety, or she has anxiety, and we all sort of have a notion of what that means. But in reality, anxiety is actually a rather complex phenomenon. And there's many different dimensions of it too. There are cognitive aspects, such as where we look, where we don't look, how we attribute things, like, oh, that's scary. Dogs are scary all the time. Every dog is scary, or just really big dogs are scary, or maybe just little dogs actually are pretty scary too. There's also emotional aspects too. What kind of emotion is sort of generated, whether it's fear, distress, or worry, anticipation. And there's also physiological correlates that we can measure along with this, and that can either be sort of setting conditions or they can be reactivity. So if an individual sort of has a higher baseline arousal, they're just always sort of a little more aroused, then they're going to be at more risk for sort of reactivity and harder time regulating. So anxiety itself is a broad construct that, again, reflects not only all these dimensions, but also reflects discrete disorders. And I'm going to focus on a few of them today that sort of are most salient in early childhood. The first is specific phobia. Specific phobia is discrete fear to an event or an object or to a situation. It's tied to that, and it's one of the fear disorders. In anxiety, there's a divergence between fear-based disorders like specific phobia and those that are more worry or cognitive aspects like generalized anxiety disorder. Specific phobia is very common in young kids. And in fact, in the new revision of the DC 0 to 5, which in some ways is like a baby DSM, they actually took specific phobia out of the categorization. So it's interesting as, the field has advanced, that we have a better understanding of when these features are sort of present and impairing. Separation anxiety is another one, which is basically an early emerging disorder associated with fear of separation from a significant caregiver. There's generalized anxiety disorder, which is much more pervasive worry about multiple symptoms. And then there's social anxiety, which is specifically tied to either performance or interaction with individuals. And for example, like I said, both separation anxiety and social anxiety and specific phobia are very often first emerging in early childhood, and they're also, the presence of any one of those is highly predictive to the occurrence of generalized anxiety, which typically occurs later on. So there's factors related to the emergence, about the trajectory, and about the predictors that are all different. And also the treatment is very different for each one of these disorders. The way you would treat an individual who has a specific phobia would be quite different than the way you would treat somebody who has generalized anxiety disorder. So the reason I'm spending a little bit of time sort of dissecting these disorders is because if we characterize them correctly within these dimensions, then they'll have really important implications across a number of domains. And as I mentioned, we can see many of these disorders emerging and being diagnosed in 8 to 10-year-olds. But in reality, 3 to 5-year-olds also present with anxiety at a disorder level. About 10 to 12% will meet criteria for anxiety in this early childhood. And we can see some features that are present in the first year of life as well. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about normal variability, because it's actually quite appropriate many times to show fear and anxiety, right? In fact, it'd be inappropriate not to. So the difference between normal variation and impairment is absolutely critical. Because being shy or maybe being inhibited in certain situations, again, can be very adaptive. In fact, it's the appropriate way to respond. When you're meeting somebody for the first time or you're in a group, it's really quite adaptive to sort of stand back and sort of see what's going on before you get engaged. So there's a lot of value to that. But also when it's sort of more extreme and interferes, then it becomes at the impairment level. Being placed on the lap of a strange man in a weird suit who, has a funny beard, screaming and wanting to be taken away is probably a normal reaction, right? But for both of these poor kids, I don't know how many of you have Christmas pictures like this. But if this happens in multiple situations, it can also potentially lead to impairment. And again, if you're just sort of one of those individuals, or the child is sort of one of those individuals who has just a few close friends and prefers a small group as opposed to being a real extrovert and preferring, large groups and all that, that's a little bit of variation just along a normal continuum, and it's all healthy. It's all absolutely a reflection of individual differences. But it's when these features become so severe that they become impairing that they need to be sort of treated, and the diagnosis often is what leads to that treatment. So it could be reflection could be by sleep problems, either difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep. Also could be in terms of reluctance to attend either school or play groups or birthday parties, whatever it is, sort of just avoiding those situations. Or it could be just sort of hanging out, being part of the group, but still not being involved. Or it also could affect families. When families make adjustments like they don't go out to dinner because it'll be too difficult for the child, or they don't do X or Y, or only one parent can go to the party because the other parent has to stay home, these are family system levels of impairment too that need to be considered. And the expression of anxiety differs in young kids than it does in older children. So it often manifests in behaviors that can be misdiagnosed as ADHD. So young kids who have a lot of anxiety will often show very erratic attention, a lot of oppositional behavior, and a lot of hyperactivity or reactivity. And we don't often think about those features as showing anxiety, but young kids don't have much of a repertoire, and that's often the ways in which they express anxiety and stress. So we think it's important to diagnose the disorders, to differentiate between impairment and normal variation. So how do we measure this? Good question. It's extremely, extremely difficult. And then when you try to diagnose it in a syndrome that has intellectual impairment, even more difficult. But at the same time, very important. So there are rating scales that exist. They're really valuable. But what about when the rating is 0, 1, or 2 for avoids people? 0, they don't avoid them at all. 1, they avoid them sometimes. 2, they avoid them all the time. What about in the case of Fragile X syndrome, when so many individuals avoid social interaction just the first 10 or 15 minutes, and by the next hour, they're in your lap, or they're having a great time? How do you answer that question? Do you 0 because no, they didn't avoid because at the end they didn't? 2 because yes, they did avoid at the beginning? Or do you average it out and have a 1? In reality, none of those answers really capture the behavior that we're trying to describe. Interviews, we can ask parents or people who spend a lot of time with individuals, well, how do they act? What do they respond? How do they respond in these situations? Some parents have great insight, some parents don't. These are really difficult behaviors to describe. We can do direct observation. We can see, what about if we show them a scary spider, or we show them this scary event, or we put them in this situation, separate them from their mom. Can't tell you how many times I was absolutely sure that the child was going to do X or Y, that they completely did Z, right? So for example, we had a child in our lab 2 weeks ago who would not separate from his mother or his father for about an hour, very long time. This is one of our typical kids. So I followed up all these complex behavioral observations with a parent interview. The mother said absolutely zero signs of anxiety or any kind of impairment. Despite that, they had to actually adjust and have the father take off from work in order for them to come and be able to do the assessment. But in her mind, there was no presence of symptoms. And then we can look at physiology. Well, physiology, again, can contribute information, but it also has its own errors and its own challenge, because what if the child just ate a jelly donut before they came to the lab and you didn't know that, or maybe there are other factors that could affect it. So the approach that we take is really to look at multiple symptoms over time. I mean, we're hoping that the combination of these data will help us have a better picture. So what I want to do is share a little bit of data that we have from our studies looking at these questions and these features in infants and preschoolers with Fragile X, contrasted to those at risk for idiopathic autism. The first study I'm going to show you is just a pilot data from a study where we used a semi-structured interview. And the reason that we're looking at these questions is, similar to autism, anxiety symptoms in young children are actually fairly stable. There have been multiple studies looking at early signs in 3 to 5-year-olds predicting anxiety as much as 11 years of age and into adulthood. So that doesn't mean that every individual child with elevated anxiety symptoms is going to end up with an anxiety disorder later, but the stability, even the subthreshold, is actually fairly remarkable at this young age. And the presence of anxiety is potentially very impairing to the child, again, impairing to the family as well. And there are some studies specifically that target parent intervention for young kids, or look at different ways to scaffold behavior, that have shown remarkable improvements in kids over time, both the reduction of anxiety symptoms and the prevention of disorders themselves. So when we're looking at these questions in Fragile X, what we want to do is try and ask questions about what are the rates of anxiety disorders, and do they differ between males and females? And right now I'm just going to show you some data from, again, that diagnostic interview, but we also have a lot of measures that have to do with anxiety on a continuum and an anxiety on symptoms that we're also collecting. So this first set of data has to do with, again, a psychiatric interview that we ask the parents in terms of the presence of these features in their children. It's called the PAPA, the Preschool Age Psychiatric Assessment, and it's an individualized interview. It takes about an hour, sometimes as many as 3 hours to complete. There's a whole series of training that we have to go through, and we have multiple consultants that are helping us sort of understand these data. Right now, the data I'm going to show you are from 23 mothers who were interviewed representing 15 males and 8 females. These are all full mutation Fragile X. The age range is from 3 to 6. So what we've come across in this measure in particular and other ones is some of the challenges with using a standardized measure that wasn't designed for individuals with Fragile X, as so many of you know. Some of the specific issues are language and cognitive impairments. So when we ask questions like, do they worry about things? Do they have nightmares? Often the parents say, I don't know, I'm not sure, I don't think so, you know, because the kids aren't able to articulate that. So what happens then is the item, it's a 0 because we don't have the presence endorsed. So sometimes these measures, even though they're, you know, sort of robust in some areas, don't apply very well to the samples we're looking at. Also, when we talk about impairment, we're talking about sort of at an individual level or at the family level. And so many of the families have made amazing accommodations and they don't endorse any impairment. They say, oh, it's not a problem, we just don't go out. Or it's not really, you know, we just sort of, they're able to sort of manage through it. So we have to kind of make decisions about whether what they've told us really is impairing, even though they themselves say that it's not. And these are things that are are issues that are unique to a degree to young kids with Fragile X. So our initial data show that collapsing the sample, that 70% of these preschoolers met for at least one disorder. 70%, yeah, lesser, 70% actually with one, and then 26% had one disorder, or had one specific disorder, 35% had multiple, and 9% had 3 or more. So it's really pretty prevalent. When we break this down by males versus females, we can see that the females actually have lower levels, but still are showing the presence of these anxiety disorders at these young ages. And then when we look at a little bit, breaking down into the specific disorders, what we can see is sort of what we would expect, which is that males with full mutation have the higher prevalence specifically of specific phobia and social phobia and GAD more so than the females. And in terms of the specific phobia targets, many of them were about dogs, and they were about situations specifically where there were crowds. We didn't see any endorsement of sort of odd phobias, at least at this young age, that are reported in individuals with idiopathic or non-syndromic autism. And that's, I know, an area that's really getting a lot of attention, which has to do with whether the features of anxiety in autism are the same or different than what we see in sort of more neurotypical individuals. So what I want to do is show you just a video clip of a 6-year-old male with Fragile X. So this is the ADOS, as most of you will recognize. Just the, you know, play-based component where he seems pretty comfortable. That's his father across the table. So then we have the imitation portion.
We're going to pretend that I don't know how to brush my teeth. Okay? So you're going to teach me. So here's the sink. Here's a hot water and a cold water. Here's a toothbrush and a toothpaste and a cup. And I want you to show me and tell me how do you brush your teeth?
Try and brush teeth.
Can you show me and tell me how you brush your teeth? Pretend here's your sink, and hot water and a cold water, a toothbrush and toothpaste, and a cup. So can you show me and tell me how do you brush your teeth?
So you see very different sort of interactions that may indicate a level of anxiety, and especially about performance-based issues. So there could be other things going on too, and this is why we're trying to take multiple measures, not only over time, but across multiple indicators as well, to try and tease this apart. But what we're doing in our lab is doing what we call like a clinical best estimate, just like what's done in, for autism. We're doing this for anxiety as well. So we have a team of individuals who are trained, including a licensed psychologist, to go through all of these data. So we have like 3 different rating scales. We have the Spence, we have the CBCL, we have the PAPA, which is diagnostic. We have an observational scale that is like a risk room where we have a scary spider, separation from mom. We have all of these data coupled with the ADOS and the Mullen and the Vineland. We take all of these issues into consideration and make a diagnosis of anxiety or not. So what I showed you was just the PAPA data early on, but I'm quite concerned that those numbers are quite high. So what we're doing now is we're going to balance those data from that measure with this clinical estimate that's really looking at all of these features within a developmental perspective, which is what we can do as clinicians looking at all of this. So we're going to actually sort of be able to compare the DSM-4 PAPA with our clinical best estimate from all of these measures, and we're also pulling in the DC 0 to 5, which is looking at some of the expressions, ways in which these disorders are expressed in young kids. So we're going to really, to me, it's become a lot of about measurement and about how do we define these constructs, how do we sort of characterize them, and how do we sort of make those adjustments for the different populations that we study. So this is just sort of one way that we're sort of looking at all of these factors to try and make the best decision about those findings. So what we know is that about 70% when we collapse males and females meet for at least one anxiety disorder at age 3 to 6. That is really high, really high. And again, I'm quite skeptical that when we sort of sort out all the issues we know they're important, that we'll sort of hold with that number. Again, a lot of them are specific phobia, which are very transient and to some degree pretty normative in preschool age. So actually, specific phobia is no longer in the DC 0 to 5 diagnostic classification for those young kids. So we're going to sort of try and look at this a little bit more closely. Males have higher rates than females. Sorry, but one point I wanted to make was that this is actually remarkably similar to the rate that's been shown in sort of one of the main studies actually out of David Hessel's lab, Cordero's study, showing the high rates of anxiety across children. It's about 70%, but that's kids like age 5 years to like, I think early 20s or 30s. It's a whole broad age range. This is just 3 to 6-year-olds. So this rate is quite high for 3 to 6-year-olds, but it's actually remarkably parallel to what we see in adults, again, for the early studies. Rates in females are lower than previous studies, whereas the males seem to be a little bit more similar. Specific phobia is almost observed in every male. So we're really concerned that this probably represents an overdiagnosis, again, the transient nature of that particular disorder. So what we're going to be doing in the future, again, is looking at these findings across the different DSM factors, and we're going to look at these within our clinical features and then look specifically at cognition and development. And so what we're doing now is, though that was a diagnostic interview at 3 to 6, most of those babies were in my baby study. So we actually have data on them as young as 6 months of age that we're now looking at the diagnostic outcomes. So we're going to sort of retrospectively now take a look back and see whether we can see some of these early features. And specifically, I'm really interested in social anxiety. So the next series of slides are going to focus on that. Because what we know is that social anxiety is very high, both in autism and in Fragile X. So we're wondering, can we see some of these features in the young kids? So most of the work that's looked at anxiety, and specifically social anxiety, uses sort of like a temperament framework to look at features of what's called behavior inhibition, which has to do with, again, sort of a reluctance to initiate interaction with an individual or in a certain situation, sort of shy, holding back. And that these early features are relatively stable, and if they're high and stable, they can predict later anxiety, specifically, again, social anxiety. So our model right now is to look at these features of behavioral inhibition along with physiology, specifically vagal tone or respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is the part of our autonomic nervous system that's responsible for just rest and restorative activity. And we're going to try and look and see whether these are later predict anxiety. So again, what we know from behavior inhibition is that it's derived from features of negative affect and excessive fear, and really sort of kind of hypervigilance towards novelty, meaning paying attention to those features as well as sort of avoidance. And what we want to do is really look at these early features and whether they actually do predict the emergence of anxiety in these kids. So what I'm going to do is show you the stranger approach that you asked about. So it's a standardized paradigm. We did not make it up. This is the 12-month-old sibling. So for 2 minutes then, it is a bit stalkerish. Yes, it is. That's why I always want to say we did not make it up, because I think people think, where'd you come up with that? It's part of a temperament battery that's been used across. It was actually designed for typically developing kids. Then the last phase is to walk away. And he is keeping an eye on her. So we use these observational methods along with all the parent interviews and along with the heart activity, along with the continuous symptom scales to try and couple together, a complete story of what's going on. So our main question here is really looking at the trajectory as well and looking at the mean levels, because a lot of evidence has shown that it's not necessarily the mean levels at any one age that appear to be the strongest predictors. It's whether it's stable or not stable, whether things increase, decrease, or stay the same. So what we found was that higher symptom severity for autism was associated with less physical escape, so sort of wrestling, trying to get away, and that higher social withdrawal was also associated with increased distress vocalizations over time. But we didn't see any associations between anxiety and any of these markers of behavior. And when I say anxiety, it's because this is the anxiety scale of the CBCL. And to me, again, it highlights the importance of knowing what those scales measure. And when you actually look at the item level for the anxiety subscale of CBCL, it makes perfect sense why a paradigm looking at social response to novelty doesn't line up necessarily with that scale, because it really isn't looking at it. The withdrawal scale actually looks at those features much more. So again, when we're not finding results, often they're not there, or it also could be a measurement issue. So we've actually sort of started really trying to look at all of these dimensions at the item level so that we can find out, if that's really what's contributing. So this is just a scatter plot showing those results that I just shared with you, which is that, so this is looking at the distress vocalizations, and this is looking at age. So what we found is that individuals who have the lower, who have stable vocal distress over time are the ones who end up with more withdrawn behavior. And again, withdrawn behavior is associated with social anxiety or social withdrawal, whereas those individuals who start off higher and have a shift aren't associated with those elevated levels. So what I'm going to sort of touch on a little bit is the intersection of autism and anxiety, because this is really at the heart of what we're trying to do, is have better measures of both. How do we really know that it's autism, or how do we really know it's anxiety, or could it be both? Because all of those scenarios are certainly possible. So what we're looking at is, again, these are just drawn from some preliminary data. And so what I wanted to do with this talk was just not only show some data, but also really focus on the questions we're asking and the methods that we're using. Okay, and so if people have specific questions about some of the results, I'm happy to talk in greater detail. So what we found was that these elevated autism symptoms in Fragile X were associated with specific discrete relationships. That higher social withdrawal on the parent rating was not associated with this measure of anxiety, but lower intensity of bodily escape during the experimental press was also not associated with it. But what we found too was that gaze to the parent during stranger, which is represented here, really did represent different patterns across these groups. These two groups, this is a group of idiopathic autism, this is a group of Fragile X with high autism features, this is Fragile X with low autism and typical controls. And when we look to see where that child was looking, which means whether they're looking to the parent or to the examiner or to the stranger, this popped out, which was that the two groups with autism seemed similar and different from the other two groups without autism in terms of looking at the parent actually more. So we think that this has to do with sort of social referencing or sort of looking to see what's sort of being, what's going on and looking to that individual, which in some ways you would think is the opposite of what you'd expect for individuals with autism. So we're trying to say, what does that sort of mean and how does this sort of predict over time? And then what a lot of these data have really shown us is that we have a lot more work to do, that we sort of have answers about some preliminary questions which just open the door for more questions to be asked. And so what we see is in terms of looking at autism, that there are symptoms of autism that emerge very early in life, and to some degree these appear to be similar to those with non-syndromic autism, but they may also have some differences as well. And one of the reasons why this is important is that it points a little bit to mechanisms into treatment. So it's really hard, as I'm speaking to the choir here, to do treatment in kids with Fragile X because of the prevalence level. So we're often reliant on either single case studies or the telehealth approach that's been so effective here. But if we can find that those early symptoms appear to be similar to non-syndromic or non-Fragile X autism, it might mean that those treatment approaches that are appropriate in young kids with Fragile X would also have the same positive outcomes in Fragile X as they were in autism. In terms of anxiety, what we found was a whopping prevalence of disorders using this one measure without sort of unpacking the caveats available with that, that we know are present. Specific phobia in particular was quite high. We also saw evidence of social phobia quite high, both in males and females as well. So females with full mutation are also showing those early signs. And so what we're looking for is these symptoms, whether they are stable or whether they sort of vary over time and what they predict. So what we're looking at is scoring and coding these indicators across our direct observations that we can then match on with our independent rating scales and the physiological markers to see if whether these factors all coalesce and sort of create information that we can be confident in to represent risk markers so that we can intervene early and optimize outcomes. That's really the whole goal of this work, is to be able to produce evidence that will feed into treatment and identification so that these kids can have the most optimal outcomes. So I want to end with thanking you for your attention and thanking all the families and also the funding sources for this work.
Thank you very much for your wonderful contributions and a great talk. But I also want to ask you about your measure of FMRP. Did you use that quantitative measure? Did you use Ted Brown's measure? Yeah, okay. Because there's lots of different measures of FMRP around.
There are, and I had a great start to my day by talking with Flora, who basically started to grill me about all of the, I'm teasing, of course, all the imprecision around behavioral assessments, which I just completely agreed with. Then I turned around and said, well, what about this FMRP thing? Are there age effects? And she was like, well, it depends whether it's this method or that method. So we agreed at the end that once we got our measures perfect, we would come back and talk. So it's interesting, and that's, I think, the value of a place like the Mind, where you sort of can have those discussions and questions and understand one another. So I can throw that up there and think that it's absolute truth, that quantitative measure is clear and cross labs and is replicated, but the reality is there's error and there's variance in that as well. So those results may hold up or not hold up.
You mentioned that you're being able to diagnose anxiety in very young children. Is there any intervention techniques that you have found that are successful for infants, young children, that you're training caregivers, family members, or does it have to be done in a professional setting?
So I don't do intervention of any type, so I don't do intervention for anxiety or for autism. So what I was referring is published studies of other people who've done that, and to my knowledge, for the young kids, it's only been done in sort of typically developing kids, which I guess is an odd phrase if they have anxiety disorders. So much of the work has been being done by a colleague in Australia, Rapay, who's really shown that with a sort of a moderate intervention with parents, basically teaching them to recognize the symptoms, to think about what factors would produce anxiety in the kids, and then a combination of both adjusting those situations, not avoiding them, but how to talk through those situations with the kids for the stress not to be too much that they can't manage it, but also not to be insufficient that they don't have to learn to cope. So it's sort of that balance between recognizing what causes anxiety and that those features are even present, because I would imagine so many of you are still going, yeah, you can't diagnose anxiety in preschoolers. And you know what, 10 years ago, that was definitely widely accepted, and now it's really been shown that you can. There's error involved in it, but those symptoms are there. And so most of the interventions for older individuals involve like a cognitive component where you sort of think, what do you think's gonna happen? Let's play through that. You can't do that with 3 to 5-year-olds, so most of it is parent-based awareness and support.
My question's related to the stranger situation. So I just overall just kind of find a person in a hat with sunglasses just kind of coming up to you and just staring in your direction and kind of not saying anything. So I guess my question is kind of two-part question. One is, what do toddlers without a lot of anxiety look like or behave in that kind of situation? And two is, I'm kind of thinking if you give there are 2 children, one, they're both very anxious. I would think maybe one child might cope with that kind of situation by clinging onto the caregiver, whereas another highly anxious kid might try to kind of run away and just detach from the caregiver and run away as far as possible. And then would you say that like one kid, based on that reaction, one kid is more highly anxious than the other? But so I kind of want to hear your thoughts about that.
About 2 people. So first of all, absolutely, putting on a hat and sunglasses, and then basically it's like a still face really too, because you're basically not supposed to be responsive to that child as well. So it's really not just introducing like a novel person. It's really sort of, to me, it's an anxiety press. I mean, that's kind of a pretty atypical. How are they going to respond? So it's not just stranger. It's like, I don't know. You have the better word is strange. It's again sort of a combination of that social stress. So we know that the downside is, how do you sort of replicate the normal everyday experience, which is what we're trying to do with meeting a novel person. We travel all across the country, so if everybody came to the lab, we could just have somebody come in and say, hi baby. We just don't do that. We actually travel to the families. So to bring an extra person and hide them in the car and have them pop up, so again, it's a limit. So when we publish this, it's a limit of the data. It is that experiment, so you're absolutely right. So in terms of your question, how do typical kids respond? So sort of an adaptive response to that weird stranger coming at you would be to be inhibited, to sort of slow down, to sort of see what's going to go on. So that approach, what you'd expect is for them to push back into their mom, who should be a safe person, watch, not say much, and basically gather information. So again, this attention, this cognitive attribute, is this person gonna do something to me? What's gonna happen? Is this scary or is this not scary? So the initial approach, you would expect sort of a wariness, and then you would sort of see over those 2 minutes of kneel, and we do see this. The kids kind of sit up, and they'll sometimes look at him. Some of them will even try to take like the sunglasses away, or they'll talk to him. It's interesting what they say, what are you doing? Why are you not talking to me? And then you're trying to be still. So we capture all of that. And those are great and then they'll say, Mom, who is this or whatever. Those are all really adaptive strategies. So that's what you would sort of expect. I mean, there's not one prototypical good modulation, but those are some of the features that you would expect. Then also from a physiological standpoint, you'd expect the heart rate to slow down because again, they're taking in information at that approach and saying what's going on. If their heart rate is super fast, then they're more likely to react. So you'd expect that sort of regulation, then you expect it to go back to sort of a normal level once they've apprised that this person is just going to kneel in front of me and it's a little strange. So in terms of your question about whether they run away, of that being more anxiety or sort of clinging. I don't really know. I don't know that anyone's sort of looked at that level of specificity yet. But I would say that clinging to your mom is going to be more adaptive than sort of running away in general. But I don't know that they're more, because maybe the kid's a little impulsive and that's what they did. So, but maybe we'll know that better in a couple of years when we can track it. Yeah, yeah. So again, a lot of these behaviors are very adaptive and they're what you'd expect. It's when they're sort of extreme or when they can't regulate that it becomes a potential problem.
I'm getting to you, Len.
So really nice talk, Jane. Thanks very much. And so I think, the two features of your approach that I really like a lot are using multiple measures to try and get at that. And the other piece, which I think is, and this is my own bias, that I think is so important, is that it's a developmental perspective. And I think that that's really critical. But I want to push a little bit on your one example, because for me, I think that that's also really telling. The idea that the specific phobias somehow are not diagnostic because they're seen in typical children. But I wonder, though, if the fact that they're often seen later, at a later age in kids with Fragile X, or that they persist for a longer period of time, is important in the sense that it creates a different dynamic with your world, right? You talked about parent accommodation. Yeah. And so when kids display unusual responses for long periods of time, or longer than average periods of time, you wonder what kind of world that creates for them and how that feeds into whatever the manifestations of that condition are later. And so I do think that it's worth, again, and I know that you know this, right? Even though this is a biologically based disorder, that what happens in the world matters in terms of kind of developmental trajectories. And so I think that's an opportunity to kind of explore that a little bit too.
Absolutely, and I think, to be clear, the sort of downplaying of specific phobia really is just in that preschool period. So it absolutely has relevant at older ages, but what they've found is that it just doesn't predict later emergence, unlike the other disorders in this particular age range. And part of it has to do with cognitive maturation. So you think about that developmental perspective, that's about the time when executive function and sort of abstract reasoning to some extent, like they get worried. This is when they're worried about the monster under the bed, right? Or they don't know the difference that it's a cartoon dinosaur and it's not a real dinosaur or whatever. So they don't have that ability or experience or language to be able to process all that. So fears sort of really kick in there. But you can also use that to your advantage, because then you can have the magic dust, that you spread, and that also the monsters aren't there. I remember with my daughter, I grabbed an old perfume bottle and it was the monster spray, and it worked. So, you can sort of figure out how to use their cognitive ability to help them manage to an extent. But you're right, and maybe these will have meaning. I don't know that we know that. So that'll be hopefully the renewal that I'll go for. We'll say their symptoms early on. The other thing is we're also measuring a lot of these features in the parents. So we know that the parents of the kids with the full mutation are carriers. So we also look at some of these features in the parents, because that also contributes to this environment. Not only the fact that the child maybe is afraid of crowds, people, or dogs, and so they can't do these sorts of things, but also the fact that maybe their parents also have a predisposition for that, and they might also, react in different ways. It's never, a one-to-one, it's never, there's a lot of complexities along with that, but we're also looking at that family in those areas as well, and what the child brings in terms of, their language. I think language is such a big feature for these anxiety disorders.
I'm not a medical person, nor am I a statistician, so maybe the answer is obvious here, but I noticed that in the first study you said there were 23 mothers, and then later with the boy, the 6-year-old boy, his father was there with him, and it got me to thinking, was it the 23 mothers because they were the primary caretaker or the primary safe person? And does it make it, is there a difference in response according to which parent the child is with? Is there any difference if mother and father are both there with the child? How the, you know?
Those are great questions. So the study with the 23 mothers was the interview, and we do interview the primary caregiver, which in about 95% of the cases is the mother. We do have, I think, maybe 3 fathers that are the primary caretaker, that we use them as informants, and we'll just have to examine whether there's differences. I'm afraid our numbers are going to be too low to really have an answer for that, but you're right. It's really about the person who can, who spends the most time with the child, who's able to really accurately reflect that. So the other experience, when I showed, when the son was there with his dad, that was on direct assessment, and that particular module requires a parent to be there. So then you're right, then that child can have the opportunity to talk to that parent or reference that parent as well. So usually it's the mother. In that case, it was the father. But you're right, there are very likely differences between responding to a mother and a father, and it's sort of beyond the scope of this study to examine that, but important to think about.
All right, I'm going to take the liberty of jumping in here with a quick question. So in some ways, Jane, I think you're kind of uniquely positioned to answer this question, which is, we all have noticed, those of us that work in Fragile X and autism, a sort of difference between this sort of presentation of autism in young kids with Fragile X who are meeting criterion for autism and those with idiopathic autism. And you know, so we all kind of wonder and ponder about, you know, how to measure that and what it really means. And you're following these kids longitudinally and observing those with Fragile X and autism, and then you're also part of the Infant Sibling Consortium, so you have the opportunity to see a lot of both types of young kids.
Yeah.
So I'd really just love to hear some of your insights about that, if you have any.
Sure, so this, I guess, off the record. I don't have any evidence for this, but I would say looking
Everything's on the record, Jane.
Oh,
You're
it
on
is,
camera.
that's true.
No, just
Okay.
kidding.
Well, it's on the record.
We can leave
but-
it off the record.
No. I think that the tools that we have to measure both anxiety and autism are blunt in Fragile X, and they don't take into consideration, I think, some of the specific sort of attributes, especially sort of the low language and some of the comorbidity with the anxiety. I think they're valuable, but I think they're limited. So I think, again, using the multiple measure is really going to help us look at that. I would say that in my almost 20 years working in Fragile X, I would say that there are definitely individuals with Fragile X who meet for autism who look very similar to idiopathic autism, meaning they have the same types of and degree of repetitive behavior, the same, you know, social communication profile. I would say that's maybe about a third of the individuals we see. Maybe there's this other sort of third that sort of maybe meet criteria, but also either also have anxiety, or maybe that those anxiety features are what's pushing sort of those scores up to some degree. And then I think there's about a third that don't seem to meet for either. And again, that's just anecdotally sort of looking at some of these features in these kids over time. I will say too that one of the measures that we've looked at is this eye contact and the social approach, and we found that when we took all the kids with Fragile X, upon that first minute of interacting with them, all of the kids, whether they ended up having high autism or low autism, all of them were avoidant by their eye contact, and they showed facial fear, so they all looked the same in that first minute. Then we repeated that exact same estimate at the end of the assessment, so about 2 or 3 hours, and the two groups sort of diverged into those that sort of warmed up and were approaching. Those were the kids that didn't have high levels of autism versus those who sort of never warmed up and continued to sort of be aloof and socially avoidant. So, but that was a dynamic measure that sort of you had to look at both the beginning and the end of those interactions. And I think those are the sorts of questions to ask, and we don't have measures that do that very well. And so I think in the Fragile X field, I know there's been some efforts to adapt measures that we have or maybe create new ones. And I think that's sort of the way to go to really answer those questions. But.
Great answer, thanks.
Hi, thanks, Susan. You know, Jane, as you're talking, I'm just thinking about this, and I think it almost would be easier to try to get to this core of what is shared with idiopathic autism and what isn't. If we put stereotypy, just took it out of the picture. because I think too often we act as if stereotypy is a symptom of autism. And we forget that this is a very general symptom of many disorders across the age range, and it is not specific to autism. It occurs in autism as well as many other conditions. That's not what's going to help us find autism in Fragile X. And actually, neither is eye contact. Eye contact can be disturbed for many reasons, and I haven't seen lots of little ones with Fragile X, but I have. And the only children I've ever seen hide their eyes are children with Fragile X. I've never seen that in the little kids I work with autism ever across my whole life. So I think, if we took those two symptoms away and then went to work at the social repertoire, responsivity, imitation, those kinds of things, I think we would learn more about what is common and what is not in those two disorders, both when social behavior is affected.
I agree, and I think too, with the stereotypy, Len's group has shown, and we've shown too, those don't sort of discriminate, sort of the fact, and it's highly tied to IQ, and so that's another confound for all of this. So I don't think we know how to target. So those are great suggestions, sort of move forward. But also, when you think about even the social communication deficits, they just sort of look a little bit different. But I will say there are some individuals with Fragile X who meet with autism that just absolutely look. We're making a lot of generalizations. Look just like those with non-Fragile X autism, and yeah.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.